lecture in literary criticism. My name is Dr. Fouzi Slisli. Today we will talk about Russian formalism. This is one of the most important schools of literary criticism in the 20th century. It's so important that almost every school of literary criticism that we have today owes a debt to Russian formalism. Briefly, Russian formalists, what they did most, that was most important, they specified the subject of literary criticism. As we will hear from the details that I will be presenting, Russian formalism specified the subject, the topic of literary criticism, and tried to illustrate the specific methods and tools that need to be used in literary criticism. Before that, literary criticism was a subject that everybody tried to claim a part of. You find historians who talk about literary criticism and people who analyzed works of literature would often analyze them by reference to the historical period, and then they would go to discuss aspects that are part of history, or they would discuss the genius of the author and therefore would go and talk about psychology. But the subject of literature was not specific. It didn't have a topic. It seemed to be, literary criticism seemed to be just hanging between a number of disciplines without a discipline, without speciality of its own. So Russian formalists tried to put an end to this confusion and tried to establish and delineate the field of literary criticism. What should the literary critic be an expert of? What kind of things that a literary critic does that the historian or the psychologist or the philosopher doesn't do? So this is generally the greatest contribution, and it's only because Russian formalists did this work of specification. In fact, one of the names that they called themselves was specifiers. They wanted to specify the task, the specific task of literary criticism. And it's thanks to this work of specification that most of the later schools of literary criticism that came later in the 20th century managed to develop their ideas and their programs. So as a school, Russian formalism, first let me give you a definition of the Russian formalist movement. It's a school of literary scholarship that originated and flourished in Russia in the second decade of the 20th century. So this is the 1914, 15, 17, 18. It flourished and produced most of its work in the 1920s and was suppressed violently in the 1930s by the Soviet communist regime. It was championed, formalism was championed by unorthodox philologists and literary historians. These were literary historians who wanted to work outside the narrow constraints of the universities where they worked. They wanted to broaden their scope. People like Boris Eichenbaum, Roman Jakobson, Viktor Shklovsky, Boris Tomaszewski, and Yuri Tinyanov. Russian formalism started with two centers. It had two centers. The first was the Moscow Linguistic Center, or the Moscow Linguistic Circle. It was founded in 1915, and the second one was the Petrograd Society for the Study of Poetic Language, known by its acronym OPOYAZ. It was formed in 1916. Their project, as they stated it themselves in this book that was published after this conference they organized. The book was called Poetics, Studies in the Theory of Poetic Language. It was published in 1919. And they also stated their project in another book by Roman Jakobson, one of the most prominent Russian formalists, published in 1921, and the book title is Modern Russian Poetry. Of course, there is some historical facts that we need to keep in mind. This is a movement that was a product of a revolution. 1917 in Russia is the year of the Bolshevik Revolution that brought the Soviet Union into existence. Prior to 1917, before 1917, the discussion of literature in Russia was romanticized and was discussed mostly from a moralistic and religious perspective, or from a psychological perspective. After 1917, after the revolution, literature began to be observed and analyzed, right? So, which means that we don't read literature just to find some moral lesson or to find some sense of like ecstasy in it, but we study literature to observe its constituents, its characteristics, its specificities, and then to analyze how these components work together. The formalist perspective encouraged the study of literature from an objective and scientific perspective. They were bored in a way, they were unsatisfied with the just happy-go-lucky theorizing about literature. People just read a book and they tell you what they feel about it. They were unsatisfied with this process. They felt that it wasn't specialized enough. They wanted literary criticism, the study of literature, to become a scholarship based on processes, techniques, tools, analyses, observations, facts, and so on. So they encouraged a scientific approach to literature. The formalist label, the name formalism or the formalists, was given to these scholars by their opponents, right? They didn't name themselves the formalists. It's their opponents who called them the formalists. The formalists themselves, they preferred the definition. They called themselves the morphological school of literature. Or they also called themselves the specifiers, because they wanted the approach to literature to be more specific and scientific and systematic. The most important scholars that made this school world famous are people like Viktor Shklovsky, Yuri Tinyanov, Vladimir Prop, Boris Eichenbaum, Roman Jakobson, Boris Tomaszewski, and Grigory Glukovsky. These names revolutionized literary criticism between 1914 and 1930s by essentially establishing the specificity and the autonomy of poetic language and literature. They basically said, what is specific about poetic language? Why is poetic language different from everyday life language that we use? What's special about poetic language? What makes poetic language literary? And by doing that, they exerted a major influence on almost every cultural and literary school of criticism that developed in the 20th century, including very prominent thinkers and philosophers like Mikhail Bakhtin, Yuri Lotman, and on the movement of structuralism as a whole. The entire movement of structuralism owes a huge debt to Russian formalism. Their projects can be described as having two objectives. They had basically two objectives. The first one was the emphasis on the literary work and its component parts, right? Emphasis on the literary work and its component parts. That means if we want to study literature, we don't go and emphasize the historical period in which the work was written, right? That's like studying history. It's not literature. We don't go and study the genius author who wrote the work. That's psychology. We want to focus on the literary work itself and the components of the work itself. And so that's the first objective. They wanted to emphasize the emphasis on the literary work itself and on its component parts. The second objective was to establish the autonomy of literary scholarship. They didn't want literary scholarship to be dependent on historical studies, on psychology, on philosophy, on aesthetics, and so on. They wanted literary scholarship to have its own scholarly foundations, its own approaches, its own subject matter, and its own methods, and its own independence. Formalism wanted to solve the methodological confusion which prevailed in traditional literary studies and establish literary scholarship as a distinct and autonomous field of study. Their principles were very basic. Formalists, first of all, this is what we can say first, what they were not interested in. They started by saying, look, these are the things we are not interested in. So, for example, they weren't interested in the psychology and biography of the author. The psychology of the author, his biography or her biography, we're not interested in it. They were not interested in the religious, the moral, or political value of literature, right? The tendency to use literature as a way to teach morality or to teach religion or to teach political values, meaning propaganda, they weren't interested in that. They weren't interested in the symbolism of literature. Formalism strives to force literary or artwork to stand on its own, right? What is it that makes it literary? What is it that makes it an artwork? People, meaning the author or the reader, the author on one side or the reader, are not important. What's important is the work of literature itself. Formalists, in that sense, rejected traditional definitions of literature. They had a deep-seated distrust of psychology. They distrusted psychology. They didn't think psychological studies of the character or the author were particularly useful for the study of literature. They rejected the theories that locate literature and literary meaning in the poet rather than the poem, right? If we look for literature, we should look for it in the poem, not in the poet. They rejected the theories that were based on the concept of the faculty of the mind that's conducive to poetic creation, the concept of the genius, the author, and so on. They had little use for all the talk about intuition, the intuition of the author, or the imagination, whether this work is a product of a rich imagination, the genius, and so on. They didn't have time for all of that. They wanted to just put all of that aside and focus on the work of literature, its components and its characteristics. To the formalists, it was necessary to narrow down the definition of literature. It should be so narrowed down and specific that it relates and it refers to literature and literature alone. For example, Roman Jakobson in 1921, he said this sentence that became very, very famous. It became almost like a motto of the formalist movement. And he says basically, the subject of literature is not literature in its totality, but literariness. Literariness. That which makes a given work a work of literature. So he says basically that the subject of literary scholarship is not literature in its totality. It's not everything we associate with literature. That's not what literary scholarship is. Literary scholarship is about literariness. Literariness. And he defined literariness as that which makes a given work a work of literature. What makes this work a work of literature? It's that characteristic that makes a poem or a novel or a piece of writing a work of literature. That characteristic is literariness, and that's what formalism wanted to study. Eichenbaum in 1927 said something similar. He said the literary scholar ought to be concerned solely with the inquiry into the distinguishing features of the literary materials. The literary scholar ought to be concerned solely, only, right, with the inquiry into the distinguishing features of the literary materials. When we say the distinguishing features of literature, that means those features that distinguish literature from other forms of writing. What distinguishes literature from other writing? What makes it specific to literature? That's what the literary scholar should be concerned with. So as you can see, Russian formalism, their project was to narrow down, to define the field of literature and literary scholarship with precision and to focus it rather than leave it as it was at the time, sprawling, some of it in the field of history, some of it in the field of psychology, some of it all over the place. So they wanted to narrow it down and make it focused and specific. So to define what literariness is, they conducted a lot of analyses and a lot of studies. The first thing was they wanted to define what poetic language is. What is poetic or literary language? And how different is it from ordinary language, the ordinary language that people speak in everyday life? How different is it from poetic or literary language? Well, the formalists said there is a radical, strict definition between ordinary language and literary language. Russian formalists argued that literature was a specialized mode of language. It's not just a language like the language we use in everyday life. It's a specialized mode of language. And they proposed a fundamental opposition, a fundamental distinction between the literary or the poetic use of language and the ordinary or practical use of language. Ordinary language, they said, aims at communicating a message by reference to the world outside the language, right? So ordinary language is concerned about conveying a message from the speaker to the listener. There is a message that's conveyed, and that message is outside language. It's an idea, it's a concept, it's a fact, or so on. Literature was a specialized mode of language. Literature, the formalist said, does not aim at communicating a message. It doesn't have a specific message to communicate. It's not like everyday language where there is utilitarian uses of language. Literature doesn't aim at communicating a message. And its reference, what it refers to, right, its reference, the ideas that it encourages the reader to explore or to get or to inquire into, its reference is not the world. It doesn't make a reference to, oh, here's a story about what happened yesterday. That would be journalism. That would be reporting an event. But literature doesn't do that. Literature refers not to the world outside, but to itself, the work, the literary text itself, the poem. And by referring to itself, that capacity, those techniques that literature uses to use a language in a way that doesn't refer to facts or things or aspects of life in general, but it refers to itself. Those characteristics, that capacity, those tools, those techniques is what the Russian formalists called literariness. And literariness, according to Jan Mukarovsky, a prominent Russian formalist, literariness consists in the maximum of foregrounding of the utterance. What does it mean? The maximum of the foregrounding of the utterance. That is, the foregrounding of the act of expression, the act of speech itself. Foregrounding, when you foreground something, you bring it into high prominence. You make it prominent, you make it obvious, you make it very prominent. So literariness means the maximum foregrounding of the utterance, a maximum foregrounding of the act of expression, of the act of speech itself. So what's being foregrounded, what's being made prominent is the act of speech. It's the act of expression. It's the use of language for literary purposes. This is what literature, this is what makes literature literary. It's the specific use of language in a way that it doesn't refer to anything but itself. When you background something, the referential aspects of language, when you background the referential aspects of language, right, when we speak in everyday life, what we foreground is the reference, right? If I say I am going to school, well, what's being foreground here is the act of me going to school, a reference to something outside of language. But when I put the referential characteristic of language in the background, poetry makes the words themselves palpable as phonic sounds. So when we put the referential aspects of language in the background, what we put in the foreground is the act of speech itself, the act of expression. The words themselves become palpable as phonic sounds. By foregrounding its linguistic medium, when poetry and literature foregrounds, puts into prominence its linguistic medium, the primary aim of literature, as Viktor Shklovsky famously put it, is to estrange, to defamiliarize or make strange, right? It's to estrange, defamiliarize, or make strange. This is one of the most famous concepts of the Russian formalists. Literariness means to make strange, to defamiliarize, right? To estrange. What does it mean? Literature makes strange ordinary perceptions and ordinary language. So when you use language in a literary way, you don't recognize that language anymore. It doesn't become an ordinary language. It looks like a strange form of language. It looks like a strange form of communication. It becomes defamiliarized. We're not familiar with it anymore. When Hamlet stands and says to be or not to be, that is the question, right? Well, that question can be said in the street between people and it would be just a communicative sentence. But once it's put in a play, on stage, with all the other components of literature, it becomes a strange use of language. That's not how people speak in everyday life. That's not how people talk. So literature shows the language itself being used in strange ways, in defamiliarized ways. And when it does that, it also creates strange forms of perceptions, strange forms of reading. There is new forms of reading when we read or listen to a poem. we listen in a different way from when we listen to ordinary language. When we read a poem, we also, when we listen to a poem, we listen in ways that are different to the ways we listen to ordinary language. Shklovsky's key term was making strange, to defamiliarize, to make strange, to disautomatization is also another word he used. This term received a wide currency. It became used not just by the formalists, but even later on by the structuralists, by post-structuralists, and it's still in common usage today. Jacobson, Roman Jacobson, claimed, also a prominent Russian formalist, he claimed that in poetry the communicative function is reduced to a minimum. In poetry, the communicative function of language is reduced to a minimum. And language becomes strange. Shklovsky spoke of poetry as a dance of articulatory organs. The articulatory organs of speech, he describes poetry as a dance of the articulatory organ. That's what poetry is. Another important contribution of the Russian formalists is a distinction between form and content. So first of all, they make a distinction between poetic language and everyday language. Then they come up with the definition of literariness, then the definition of the concept of to estrange, to defamiliarize, to make strange, and then they make a distinction between form and content. Formalism rejected the traditional dichotomy of form versus content, which, as René Wellek and Warren put it, they say this distinction of form versus content, it cuts a work of art into two halves, a crude content and a superposed, purely external form. So the form-content distinction, they said, is useless. We don't need it. It cuts the work of art into two halves. The first half is a crude content, you know, the story of the play or the novel, and the crude content is superimposed, purely external, a superimposed, purely external form. To the formalist, verse or poetry is not merely a matter of external embellishment, such as meter, rhyme, alliteration, superimposed upon ordinary speech. So poetry is not simply the use of these stylistic techniques like meter and rhyme and alliteration, and we just superimpose those on ordinary speech. That's not what poetry is. Poetry is an integrated type of discourse, qualitatively different from prose, with a hierarchy of elements and internal laws of its own. So the distinction content versus form, it's gone. That's it. The formalists argue that the content and the form blend together, making up an integrated system that has quantitatively different from prose, from everyday ordinary speech, and with a hierarchy of elements and with internal laws of its own. Another important distinction that Russian formalists brought was the distinction between plot and story. Plot and story. Traditional criticism does not make a distinction between plot and story. Plot is, to the present, many people think plot. When we say the plot of a novel, they simply think it's the story of the novel. But the formalists disagree, and I think they were closer to Aristotle's definition of plot. Plot for Aristotle is not simply the story of a tragedy, but if you remember, Aristotle defines plot as the sequence of cause and effect sequences, the cause-effect sequence and the way it is presented to the reader, the way that cause-effect sequence is presented, the presentation of that cause-effect sequence in the play to the reader. This is what he calls plot. And this is different from what people call the story. So Russian formalists, in a way, bring back this Aristotelian definition and end this confusion that simply sees plot as a story. Plots, the events of the work, the events that the work relates, are the story. This is the story, right? The sequence in which those events are presented in the work, that's the plot. And as you can see, the definition of Russian formalists is closer, is more in line with Aristotle's definition of the plot. So they make a distinction between the story, which is the events that the work relates, right? That's the story, very simple. But the plot is the sequence in which those events are presented in the work. What sequence? Is it 1, 2, 3, 4? Is it 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4? Is it 3, 4, 1, 2, 5, 6? There is so many ways to present those events. So plot is about the sequencing. Story is simply what the story is. Both concepts, these concepts, plot and story, help describe the significance of the form in a literary work. Form is very significant. That's what the formalist said. Form is very significant. The way, for example, the sequence of the plot is organized it is integral to the quality of the literary work. In order to define literariness, we need to be aware of these characteristics of the form, plot, the story, the estrangement, familiarization, the type of language that's being used, and so on and so forth. For the Russian formalists as a whole, form is what makes something art to begin with. It is the form, meaning that's where the techniques are, that's where the literary techniques and the literary uses of language in ways that are different from ordinary uses of language. That's the form. It's the form that makes language literary. Form is what makes something art to begin with. So in order to understand the work of art as a work of art, rather than simply an ornamented communicative act, one must focus on form, right? Because poetry is not just beautiful language, it's not just language with some communicative ornaments. That's just beautiful speech. Poetry is a use of language in a way that creates a literary form, right? So there is a certain type of mechanisms, tools, and an integrated system of tools that all contribute together. Plot, story, technique, character, all of it works together. The use of meter, rhythm, alliterations, images, all of that are part of an integrated system that makes a piece of writing a work, right? A work of literature. Another very important area and very influential aspect of the formalist work was their analysis of folk tales. And a prominent example is the work of Vladimir Prop, mostly his book, The Morphology of the Folk Tale. This is one of the most influential formalist contributions to the theory of fiction. And it's based on the work of Vladimir Prop, Morphology of the Folk Tale. Vladimir Prop studied hundreds of folk tales, fairy tales, folk tales, right? And he established character types and events associated with them. He realized that all folk tales, wherever you go, even in the four corners of the world, folk tales have similar patterns that they follow. He reduced these patterns to 31 functions and 7 broad character types. 31 functions and 7 broad character types. He said any folk tale anywhere in the world will have to follow this pattern. It doesn't have to have all the 31 functions. It probably have 7 of them, 8 of them, 10 of them, 20, up to 31 of those functions. And the 7 broad character types, most of the time it has all 7 of them, sometimes just 5 or 6 or 4. And Vladimir Propp said that these patterns, these 31 functions and these 7 character types can also apply to other forms of narratives. So I'll just explain these 31 functions to you very briefly. Any folk tale follows these patterns. For example, in any folk tale there is an element of the absentation. It starts with an absentation. One of the members of a family absents himself from home or is dead, right? The second function is called the interdiction, right? There is an interdiction is addressed to the hero. Don't do this, or do not open that door, or do not leave the house open when you leave. These are interdictions. And then the third function follows. It's a violation of the interdiction, where the interdiction is violated. The hero does leave the house open, or does open that door, or does the things that he was that there was an interdiction not to do. The fourth is reconnaissance, where the villain, there is a villain of course, the villain makes an attempt at reconnaissance, right? Number 5 is delivery. The villain receives information about his victim. Number 6 is trickery. The villain attempts to deceive his victim in order to take possession of him or his belongings. Number 7 is complicity. The victim submits to deception and thereby unwittingly helps his enemy. Number 8 is villainy or lack, where the villain causes harm or injury to the member of a family or to one member of a family, either lacks something or desires to have something. Number 9 is a function called mediation. Misfortune or lack is made known. The hero is approached with a request or a command: go do this, or go liberate the princess, or go, capture the villain. And he is allowed to go, or he is dispatched. He is dispatched somewhere. We need you. Come over here. Number 10 is called the counteraction. The seeker agrees or decides upon counteraction. The hero accepts the challenge and takes it. Number 11 is a function called the departure. So the hero goes on his mission, right? Number 12 is called the first function of the donor. The hero is tested, interrogated, attacked, etc., which prepares the way for his receiving either a magical agent or a helper, an assistant. Number 13 gives us the hero's reaction. The hero reacts to the action of the future donor. Number 14 is called the receipt of the magical agent or the assistance. The hero acquires the use of a magical agent. Number 15 is the guidance. Then there is 16, the struggle, where the hero and the villain join in direct combat. Number 17 is branding. The hero is branded, meaning he is injured in a way that, remains like a brand on him physically. Number 18 is the function called victory. Here the villain is defeated And then number 19 is the liquidation, where the initial misfortune or luck is liquidated, if it's a spell or if it's... Number 20 is the return, the hero returns home. Number 21, the hero is pursued on his way back. And number 22 is the rescue of the hero from the pursuit. Number 23, there is always an unrecognized arrival. The hero comes back home, but he's unrecognized, or he's in another country. Number 24 provides an unfounded claim. It's called the unfounded claim. A false hero presents himself to the community and claims to be the hero. Number 25th is a function in which there is a difficult task is proposed to the hero because they need to establish who is the real hero. And number 26, the task is resolved. It's called the solution. Number 27, the hero is recognized, right? It's called the recognition. Number 28, the false hero or villain is exposed. It's called the exposure. 29, the hero is given a new appearance. It's called the transfiguration. So he has a new appearance, wears nice clothes, and so on. Number 30, the villain is punished. It's called punishment. And the last one, number 31, and it's the one that most all fairy tales end with, it's the wedding, where the hero is married and ascends to the throne and becomes prince or king or so on. Vladimir Prop also, so these are the 31 functions. Any folk tale will have some or all of these functions. It might have 10, 15, 20, or 31. But you take these 31 functions and they apply on any folk tale. In fact, if you look at Vladimir Prop, his book, Morphology of the Folk Tale, he has there dozens of folk tales that you can see how, these 31 functions apply to. Vladimir Prop also devised 7 character types, and it also they apply they apply on all folk tales and even to other forms of narratives or stories or plays and so on. So these are, the first one is the villain. He struggles against the hero. The second one is the dispatcher. The dispatcher is a character who makes the luck known and sends the hero off. So he dispatches the hero into the problem. He informs the hero that a breach has happened and a mission is waiting for you. You need to go and solve it. The third character is the helper, or sometimes the magical helper, and he helps or she helps the hero in their quest. Number 4 is the princess or the prize, and here the hero deserves her throughout the story, but is unable to marry her because of an unfair evil, usually because of the villain. So the hero's journey, his quest, his journey, is often ended when he marries the princess, thereby beating the villain and exposing his schemes. Next one is the father. This is number 5, the father of the princess. He gives the task to the hero. He tells him, we have a mission. There is this, villain who has done A, B, C, D. We need you to go and either dispose of him or reverse this situation and change it. The father also identifies the false hero in the end, when the hero comes back but he is unrecognized and there is a false hero. The father also marries the princess to the hero. Vladimir Prop noted that functionally the princess and the father cannot be clearly distinguished, that they can be the same morphological character type. Number 6 is the donor. The donor is a character type that prepares the hero or gives the hero some magical object that helps him in achieving his mission. Number 7 is the hero or victim, hero or victim. He is the seeker or hero. He reacts to the donor and weds and marries the princess. This is the hero of the tale. And number 8 is the false hero. He takes credit for the hero's actions or tries to marry the princess. And very often, sometimes, the false hero and the villain are the same character type. So either we have 7 character type if they are the same. If the villain and the false hero are not the same, then we have 8 character types. More or less, this is the contribution of Russian formalism to contemporary criticism. I want to talk very briefly now about their legacy. What did they leave behind for literary criticism? The formalist school is credited even by its adversaries, people who opposed it. For example, in the Soviet Union, the Soviet regime opposed the formalists and, you know, kicked them out of Russia, and you know, most of them went and settled either in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, or in Paris, or eventually went to the United States. So even their opponents or critics, for example, Yefimov, the Russian critic Yefimov, he says the contribution of our literary scholarship lies, meaning Russian formalists, their contribution to literary scholarship lies in the fact that it has focused sharply on the basic problem of literary criticism and literary study. They focused it, first of all, on the specificity of its object, meaning literature. The object became very specific, that it modified our conception of the literary work and broke it into its component parts. It broke the literary work into its component parts. Also, it opened up new areas of inquiry, vastly enriched our knowledge of literary technology. Literary technology, I mean the fact that we can talk now about literary technology. Before we talked about style or technique. Now with Russian formalists, we talk about literary technology, that the writer or the poet or the literary person deploys an entire system of literary technology. The formalist also, he says, raised the standards of our literary research and of our theorizing about literature and affected, in a sense, a Europeanization of our literary scholarship. This is especially relevant for Russia. Russian literary scholarship used to be separate from European tradition, but with the formalists, with the formalist school, the Russian tradition of literary criticism and literary scholarship, you know, became integrated with the European tradition of literary scholarship. Poetics, he says, poetics became an object of scientific analysis, a concrete problem of literary scholarship. This is a quote basically from their opponent explaining their contribution to literary scholarship. Russian formalism also gave rise to the Prague school of semiotics, or the Prague school of structuralism, that appeared in the 1920s. And also Russian formalism provided the model for the literary wing of French structuralism. French structuralism had a very powerful literary wing in the 1960s and 70s. We will talk about that. This is the wing of Roland Barthes, Gérard Genette, Tzvetan Todorov, Julia Kristeva, Greimas, and other French structuralists. This is the literary wing of French structuralism. Without the contribution of the Russian formalists, that French structuralism would not be possible. The literary theoretical paradigms that Russian formalism inaugurated are still with us and still has a vital presence in the theoretical discourse of our day. And all in all, in general, all contemporary schools of criticism owe a huge debt to Russian formalism. So this, in general, is the contribution, the ideas of Russian formalism to 20th century literary criticism, and briefly also their legacy, the legacy that they left behind and benefited the movements behind them. And that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you so much for listening. And I'll see you in our 8th lecture, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.